One of the most important tasks for you in assessing historiographical issues in the IA and on the exams also is recognizing that certain schools of thought exist in the field of history. This is very similar to assessing schools of thought in economics or in psychology or recognizing an art movement or a literary movement. Over the course of the history of history, current events and intellectual trends within society have led to shifts in how history is researched and written, and each school of thought seeks to improve upon the shortcomings of its predecessors. Now, again, that it still tends to build upon that scholarship rather than rejecting it outright. So in practical terms, it's important that you know these schools of thought and that you're able to place a particular secondary source into one or the other relatively accurately. Now we'll start by looking at the pre-modern or the ancient schools of thought, going, all the way back to earliest recorded history. And the earliest of these are the chroniclers, who you may take from the term undertook the task of simply writing down what was going on in the world around them in some sort of diary or journal format. The remnants of this continue today in things like blogs and Facebook and Instagram posts and the like. The earliest chronicles came from Southwest Asia, from China, from South Asia, but this is very much a global movement. Every civilization with some form of recording events did it. Chronicles are vitally important to historians of the early world because documentation of those areas is so limited. The problem is that they tend to be hit or miss, focusing usually just on major events, and they tend to be commissioned by political leaders of the day who want to record the events of their reign, and so that naturally is intended to tout how great they were. Coming after that are the Greco-Roman historians. This represents the first departure from the rather myopic perspective of the chroniclers who just look at things from the view of the king. The more democratic nature of the societies in the Mediterranean in the ancient world allowed for thinkers like Herodotus and Thucydides and Titus Livy to take a little more of an objective view of history, but only a little more. Greco-Roman historians still tend to focus on big political events like wars and such. And they're also guilty of embellishment. If the story isn't very interesting, they take poetic license and kind of jazz it up a little bit. And when answers aren't available, they tend to fill in the gaps by claiming that these things are the actions of the gods. Now, you remember from world history, the fall of the classical civilizations leads to a significant shift in worldview known in intellectual history as the Axial Age. You probably remember it if you took AP World History as the era of the spread of religions, most notably Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. From roughly the 3rd century AD to the 16th century AD, the historians who were not chroniclers tended to be grouped into a school that we might call the school of religious affirmation. History was written in order to justify or apply a particular religious perspective in a real world context. So everything was about bolstering the validity of religious dogma. Most notable in this group are the historians of the Islamic Golden Age. You have the Syrian Al-Farabi, the Persian Al-Ghazali, and greatest of all of them is Ibn Khaldun of Cairo, who is actually the first historian to actually recognize historiography, to recognize that history is written differently over time. However, this approach to history is actually most extensive in Europe, where feudal society and divided political authority and the low level of literacy really allowed ecclesiastical records to really dominate intellectual affairs and, as a result, dominate the written history. Now, it's at this point we make the jump to consider modern historical scholarship. And we'll do a very non-IB thing and focus all of our attention on the West. It's important that you don't infer any value judgment in this. We're not ignoring the history of the rest of the world. It's simply a matter of practicality. In my experience, all of you are going to be gathering sources from historians who use a modern Western historiographical approach, which, by the way, now is used universally. So first we're going to consider a couple of European schools of thought, and then we'll treat the American and European schools together as we move along. The dynamic forces of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation leads to a revision of historical study. Historians that we might call Reformationists began to approach history in a manner that A, was far more secular, and B, was rooted very heavily in documents. And it's important that you recognize that being a Reformationist historian had nothing to do with being pro-Protestant. These historians abounded in Catholic countries like France and Spain as well. What makes them reformationists is this transition in the way that history is written, trying to focus on documents and secular events rather than just religious. It had everything to do with breaking the church's monopoly in intellectual pursuits and on a revived primacy of the written word in intellectual affairs. Of course, we can thank Mr. Gutenberg for that. Now, Reformationist approaches still tended to reflect a lot of religious and chronicling perspectives until the early 19th century, and then the new modes of thought that characterized the Enlightenment in Europe were applied to history as well. And this led to the rationalist or Hegelian school of thought. It's pioneered by the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. The rationalist school emphasized a more scientific approach to writing history based on a philosophical construct known as the dialectic. To Hegel, all history is driven by ideas, and historical processes were the result of mankind coming to terms with a new idea coming to challenge the old ones. This is the approach to taking history out of the political and religious context and applying a rational cause and effect to events. So Hegelian historiography is going to dominate the field well into the 20th century. And it's also here that we can note the rise of the first American school of historical thought. The independence movement against the British included an effort to forge new intellectual paths. And in history, it's brought about by the focus on pretty contemporary history. So you see from the beginning, Americans think about history in very recent terms. They couch their studies within the process of the rise of the United States as an independent country and of the Constitution as the basis for the government. So this foundationalist school, if you will, includes people like Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. These are some of the earliest uses of foundationalist thought, and this school tends to dominate American history until we get to the Civil War. Now, following the Civil War, the European industrialist philosophy of positivism became very popular among American scholars. Positivism emphasized using modern scientific approaches to address social and economic concerns like education, like poverty, like socio-political efficiency, things like that. We know its applications in the U.S. as progressivism, a different name, but it means the same thing. And just as there were social and political progressives like Teddy Roosevelt here, there was a progressive school of history as well. Progressive historians tended to focus on providing answers to the causes of the Civil War and to the rise of the U.S. as a modern industrial nation of democracy and free markets. The most notable of the progressive historians was Frederick Jackson Turner, whose frontier thesis is one of the landmark historical theses for American development, and you probably discussed it last year. If you'll recall, it was the genesis of this idea of American exceptionalism. The other notable progressive for you was someone who you know not for his history writing, but for his political career, Woodrow Wilson. Before Wilson became president, he was a progressive historian at Princeton. Progressive history dominates American classrooms at least as far as the Great Depression in most parts of the country. While American historians spend the late 19th, early 20th century focusing on the frontier as the key to American greatness, European historians are channeling the currents of their region's rise to zenith through the vitality of the nation and the nation state. The European nationalist school of thought, it's also called the imperialist school, utilized a perspective very heavily influenced, if you remember from world history, by social Darwinism to provide answers to the reasons for the rise of Europe as the dominant region of the world, and for problems and justifications of empire building and so forth. The White Man's Burden, if you remember that, is a poetic reflection of the European imperialist school's principle of mission civilisatrice, the West's duty to civilize the rest of the world. The key to this school of thought's work was national vitality and power. Its studies point to national and cultural characteristics that make the country great, or on comparative studies of how one country measured up to its neighbors. Usually that it's compared to a strong ally and why we're similar, or a bitter enemy and why we're different. So this school of thought, it prevails through the beginning of the 20th century, and then it dies a very abrupt death after the World Wars, and we will see why as we move along. Now, another European school that is still very active today came together in France after the First World War. It's known as the Annales School, and it pervades all of the social sciences. It's not just history. It's very much a reaction to the conflagration of the Great War, which many saw as being in part the fault of such a heavy focus on nationalism. Annales historians, therefore, they took to try to understand historical events using the least nationalistic tool possible. That's mathematics. Annales historians rely very heavily on statistical analysis, and their work is loaded with tables and graphs and charts and explications of disaggregated data. This brings an entirely new approach to writing history and helped to galvanize those who had been attempting to make the discipline standard more scientific and more objective ever since Hegel. Economic historians obviously are going to flock to the Annales school. However, the Annales approach, we need to realize, is obviously very limiting. You can only really write histories of things that can be quantified in the Annales approach. So it's hard to write cultural history, intellectual history, art, even a lot of social history. It's hard to write that way. Still, the Annales approach, it's critical to contemporary historiography, and it became the almost exclusive approach to historiography in the communist world, where after Lenin, the mantra became one of scientifically systematizing the worker's paradise. This brings us then to our contemporary schools of thought, the ones you will interact with the most. The end of World War II completely devastated European intellectual pursuits. And at that point, American historians take the lead in initiating new historiographical approaches. From roughly the 1940s through the mid-60s, a school of thought known as the Orthodox or sometimes conservative school held sway. For all intents and purposes, the efforts of Orthodox historians are focused on assessing processes by which the United States becomes a world superpower. It tends to be very heavily focused on political, military, diplomatic history, and many who write popular history in the Orthodox school couch everything in the Cold War context, that the things that make America great and the Soviet bloc terrible. This doesn't happen much in academic history, but it happens a lot in popular history. The Orthodox school is critical in bringing out an acceptable objective history and for being able to get beyond the romantic notions of things like manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. However, their work still really narrowly focused to political history, and it tends to be very apologetic in its approach when it comes to embarrassing processes in national history like slavery and Native American subjugation. Those things are just kind of glossed over, even though Orthodox historians are openly critical of shameful events in the histories of other countries like Stalinism and the Holocaust and things like that. You'll still find a few Orthodox historians out there, but this school effectively has been completely abandoned with the rise of the next two American schools in the 60s and in the 80s. Now, we don't know that the 1960s were a very dynamic and volatile time in every respect. The civil rights movement is going on everywhere. In the U.S., there are concerns about the Vietnam War, the cultural revolutions happening in China. Great Society programs are implemented in the U.S. In Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring in 1968. Germany and Italy has domestic terrorism with the Red Army faction and the Red Brigades. There are 3 Israeli-Palestinian wars, decolonization. There's lots of really radical stuff going on. So it's only logical that there'd be a really radical shift in historiography as well. This movement begins simultaneously in universities in the U.S. and in Western Europe, and it quickly spreads to become the universal approach to writing history from the 60s to the mid-80s in every corner of the world except for the communist bloc. In most of the world, it's known as the Marxist school of thought, but Cold War sensibilities in the U.S. don't allow that terminology, so they're called revisionist historians here in the U.S. First things first, it is absolutely critical that you understand that despite the name that links these historians to Karl Marx, they are not necessarily communists. In fact, almost none of the revisionists in the U.S. had communist leanings because it'd be really hard for them to hold a job in Cold War United States universities. Note again that this school of thought doesn't come into play at all in the communist bloc during the Cold War, so clearly the Marxist issue isn't tied to being pro-communist. Rather, what links them to this Marxist school of thought is simply the reference to the fact that, like Karl Marx, these historians tend to view historical processes as a function of social and economic struggle. They're also generally the historians who provide the voice for minority groups, labor unions, others who spend much of history being ignored and disenfranchised. Thus, revisionists are critically important in bringing to light a richer, fuller, more representative history. But Marx's influence also comes out in the fact that their conclusions tend to be very generalized and lacking in nuance. One or two things, usually imperialism or corporatism, tend to dominate their understanding of everything in history. Everything in history to them can be blamed on those couple of things. So, for as much as they speak for the little guy, revisionists tend to see history moving along the path of great forces and defining events. The heyday of this school is the 70s and the 80s, and though there are still many revisionists out there, there aren't any new historians who are really pursuing the revisionist approach anymore. Three key events occur in the late 1980s that lead to another shift in historiographical practice. The first is the significant thawing in Cold War relations and eventually the collapse of the communist bloc. The second is the rise of information technology that has become such a staple in our lives today. The former opened up access to massive amounts of new documents that were inaccessible during the Cold War, especially from the communist world, the Russian archives, the East German archives, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. The latter, the technology, helped to make almost all of that data accessible, recordable, able to be analyzed by any historian pretty much anywhere in the world. So these two things come the key weapons to the post-revisionist school of historiography. Post-revisionists are still the most prevalent school of thought among historians today, and they really show no signs of faltering. Their approach attempts to target the great philosophical flaw in the orthodox and revisionist approaches. Both the orthodox and revisionist approaches lack a moderate voice and tend to be too reductionist in their analyses. They tend to blame everything too much on big things. The post-revisionists then seek to consider as many different perspectives as possible and to come to a middle ground in providing an assessment. Obviously, since they still tend to be the preferred school of thought today, there isn't a lot of criticism to the post-revisionist approach. And in fact, many prominent Orthodox and revisionist historians have actually adapted to the post-revisionist methodology. Post-revisionist history isn't always the most exciting in that it neither trumpets inequality and oppression the way its predecessors have, but it does tend to spread the praise and the blame around pretty equally. So as a result, most who critique post-revisionist history praise it for being a bit more real world in its approach. There are a couple of other new schools that are still in their infancy, and their standards of historiography are still being established. So we're going to have to wait and see the degree to which they become real mainstream or very well established. First, we go outside of North America and discuss the neo-nationalist school. Neo-nationalists have become quite mainstream in regions that went through decolonization, and that includes Eastern Europe. So this is really popular in sub-Saharan Africa, in much of Central and Southern and Southwest Asia, even Southeast Asia and parts of East Asia like China. Very simply, they are the voice of new countries who wish to redefine their histories in a manner that separates themselves from a past under the control of overlords, imperialists. What's interesting is that the neo-nationalists are kind of a hybrid between the old imperialist school and the more recent revisionist school. So like the revisionists, they vehemently denounce the effects of imperialism, domination by the superpowers, inequalities of social and economic forces, and so on. However, they also tend to have a very strong dose of nationalism infused in them, and in many cases would rival anything written by fascist historians in the 30s. Neo-nationalist historians only tend to have academic recognition within their own countries, but they do have quite a bit of popularity among the masses in those countries who are interested in that kind of thing. Finally, a much more scholarly school is developed in North America and some of Western Europe. The deconstructionist school is often referred to as microhistory. They utilize the advantages that modern information technology offers to researchers. Deconstructionists focus their attention on the lives of ordinary individuals living through great historical events through the examination of documents like diaries, letters, photographs, and the like. Their work's been very interesting in that in many cases it's shown that some of the generalities that we ascribe to a particular social group at certain points in history just don't always hold. In some cases, in fact, they're completely wrong. And the focus on one or a few individuals tends to make this history a little more intriguing to the popular reader who can kind of get a real person, individual life feel to the history. We just have to keep in mind that the lesson cuts both ways. Though microhistory may show us that individuals may experience historical events differently, than we previously expected, we have to remember that they are one individual in very specific circumstances, so they can't always represent the whole. We can't look at microhistory and say, well, that's certainly the way how everything happened. They just give us a better perspective on what did happen. So again, in the overwhelming majority of the work you will do in this course, you will be dealing only with historians from the orthodox, revisionist, and post-revisionist school of thought, with the occasional deconstructionists mixed in. How do you tell them apart? Think in these terms. If our topic at hand, for example, is westward expansion in the United States, what are the different schools of thought going to say about that? Well, the Orthodox historian is going to laud the pioneering spirit, the ingenuity, the opportunism of Americans of the day who made the country strong, productive, and a land of democracy and freedom. The revisionist historian is going to respond to that and say that it was actually all the result of an imperialist agenda by big business interests and the politicians they supported, who in the process exploited the labor of black slaves and immigrants, in the meantime annihilating the Native American population. The post-revisionist historian is going to come in then and respond that the exploitation of disenfranchised groups can't be denied, but that in the process a system was put in place that did seek to correct that disenfranchisement, that in many cases those among the oppressed groups rose to not only take advantage of the new opportunities provided by the new system, but to thrive in it and even become greater assets to the cause of their concerns. And then finally, the deconstructionist historian is going to argue that none of that really is the point. Rather, the key is how those events of the day were experienced by individuals living through the process and experienced the change that brought about. All that really matters is the individual life. So you can see there where you can take a key event in history and work it through the different schools of thought and come to different perspectives. We're going to do the same thing when we look at the causes of the Civil War and see just how clean and how definitive those causes really are from the perspective of these different schools.